Let's get started. And we're going to begin our IBC review and our key takeaways from what was an exhausting but perhaps exciting conference in Amsterdam in 2024. For those of you who haven't met me, my name's Dan Jenkins. I'm going to be hosting the session for the next hour. Don't hesitate to reach out and get connected with me on LinkedIn. I'm a big LinkedIiner. So I'd love to get connected on there and take the conversation further. I always like talking digital marketing, broadcast media, the whole AV sector as well. So don't hesitate to reach out and get connected with me on LinkedIn. So a little bit about Wagada Digital. Some of you may be familiar with us, but for those who aren't, we're an award-winning digital marketing agency. We offer a full suite of kind of digital marketing services. We do website development. We're HubSpot Platinum partners, so we support brands with implementation of HubSpot, sales and marketing alignment, the full HubSpot shebang, and employer branding as well. We have 3 offices in the UK, in London, St Albans and Cheltenham. We've got a whole team of specialists with expert in-depth knowledge, and we're experts in the broadcast, media, AV and tech sectors. We work with a wide range of international brands from Canon and ISO through to Pixotope and CVP. So it's really exciting to be working and speaking with you all today. Something I just want to draw your attention to, if there are any HubSpot users in the room as well, there is going to be something running called Spot Check in this quarter, whereby you can basically get a free audit and a free review of your HubSpot usage. We'll send all of the details and the link, but if you're looking to get more out of HubSpot, there'll also be an opportunity for you to do that this autumn, and we can support you in that area. So IBC 2024, what can we take away from that? Well, look, there was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of talk. There was a lot of language surrounding everything from kind of security and the future of security and the relationship between broadcasters and vendors in those areas. But looking more on the content and the creativity side of things, it goes without saying that AI dominated a lot of discussion. But interestingly, more and more about the practical use of AI. You know, AI has accelerated over the last couple of years exponentially, and the talk for a long time has been much more theoretical as we're all kind of getting to grips with it and trying to understand how to better implement AI. But we're talking more and more now about the practical uses of AI, and some of our panel are going to be delving into that in a little bit more depth shortly. In line with that, there's a lot of emergence of new technologies, which in turn is not just going to benefit the consumer and the content consumer, but is also going to improve general efficiencies. Interconnectivity and content distribution, you know, the Internet of Things has been around for years, but we're talking more and more now about the Internet of Things in kind of real terms and how we consume content and the whole concept of interconnectivity. And in line with that, we've got that changing nature of user engagement across media streams. It's more and more about short form content, about different types of content and different ways to engage with your content, and ensuring that sort of broadcasters are delivering services and solutions in line with those customer expectations. So this change is going at quite a pace, and there's a lot to consider as we move into 2025. And again, we'll go deeper into some of these areas now when we tackle this in our panel discussion. So enough about me and my takeaways from IBC, which was, I agree, busy, exciting, and also exhausting. But what I'm going to do now is hand over to our panelists one by one. So we're going to start off with Meet the Panelists. They're going to do a quick introduction. Then we're going to have David Thompson from the DPP giving a bit of an introduction to the DPP side of things and the most recent report. Then we're going to have a panel discussion, and hopefully if there's time at the end, we'll have a little bit of a Q&A. So David, over to you if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we'll meet Danielle and we'll meet Ian as well. But first things first, David, if you'd like to say hi.
Hello, my name is David Thompson. I'm technology strategist at the DPP. So what I do is I head up DPP's kind of technological offerings. That includes insight reports, such as the one we're going to be discussing shortly from IBC. It also includes collaborative projects in technology with our partners. So we did recently a project with Warner Brothers and Reuters about LPX and, you know, improving live production exchange of content. And it also includes kind of what we call it Innovation Showcase now, which is giving a panel for both customers as well as vendors to come in and speak about interesting projects. So Ian Wagner's been on that in the past, and it's something that we run as well. So it's kind of giving our members a forum for presenting interesting technology.
Thank you so much for that, David. Danielle Harper.
Hello. So yes, my name's Danielle Harper. I'm an account director at Bubble Agency, which is a global PR and marketing agency that specializes in media and broadcast, among other verticals. And so we represent clients across the entire content supply chain. And that gives me a great insight into the latest innovations and trends that have been happening at IBC, from capture, ingest, and acquisition right through to delivery, play out, and analytics, and all the stages in between. So I kind of get this overview of the key takeaways that connect all these different workflows together, as well as exploring different consumption patterns, audience behavior, for insights on how the entertainment sector really needs to evolve over the next few years to meet that audience demand.
Fab. Thank you so much, Danielle. Really appreciate it. And last but not least, Ian.
Hi, yeah, thanks. So Ian Wagden, I work with BBC Research and Development. For those of you who don't know, we are part of the public service arm of the BBC, and we look at sort of new and emerging technologies, how we can apply them in the broadcast and online space to serve our audiences. But we also do a whole bunch of standards work and future gazing and sort of testing of concepts and things like that. And I work in our commercial partnerships and engagement team. So I work quite a lot with things like the IBC accelerators and other innovation projects that help sort of drive some of the ideas that come out from R&D forward into practical use.
Brilliant. Ian, thank you so much. So without further ado, David, I'm going to stop screen sharing and I'm now going to hand over to you. And David's going to talk a little bit about DPP and that side of things.
Okay. Can you see my screen okay? Good. All right. So for those of you that do not know the DPP, so we're an industry organization representing companies in the entertainment and media space. So we have about 500 member companies across North America, Europe, as well as some within Asia and Latin America. The report that I'm going to be speaking about is called Demand versus Supply. And essentially, at every of the major trade shows, so NAB and IBC, we look at sort of key points that are key customer needs that our members are talking about. And then we go around the shows to see how well the market is responding to those needs. And they basically change with every show. So we begin by looking at what our members have been talking about at different DPP events and then moving on from there. For the latest report, we basically talk to a lot of our members. So these are some examples of companies. We start by holding a series of customer workshops where we get customers together and we say, okay, so what are the areas that, what are the pain points you've been finding in particular, in these particular topics? And then what I then do is go around IBC and have an exhausting set of 3 days or 4 days of meetings speaking to people, which is very exciting because you get to see a lot of ways vendors are tackling problems in different ways and often ways that are unexpected as well. So it is very good fun. So this is just an example of some of the topics we covered in the last 3 reports. So they began when I joined the DPP in January of last year. So these are some of the existing topics. So I know some of them I've probably spoken to others, people who are on the call about some of these topics in the past and maybe even at IBC this year. So the latest report is literally hot off the press. Well, not quite off the press yet. So it gets published on the 26th of September, so on Thursday. And for those of you who are DPP members or work for DPP member companies, you can download it from the website. The 4 topics we covered for IBC this year, the first one was around innovating the newsroom. And this came out of a lot of our customers were saying, news is it's kind of on the cutting edge, or sort of on the forward line of a lot of what the issues that we're facing now. So, dispersed audiences, lots and lots of content coming in and needing to sort of meet those demands. So that was the first topic we looked at. The second one was empowering creators, looking at ways in which technology is helping to allow creators to create more content for less money. There's a huge drive right now from broadcasters and channels to lower the cost of production and also look for new sources of content. So that's the second one. The third one is understanding audiences. So again, it's difficult in the current digital age of people coming in from all over the place, and it's difficult to really understand what it is that your audiences are doing and what it is they like across multiple platforms. And that was a huge pain point. And then the fourth one is engaging users. And this is looking at different ways to sort of keep users, watching, to get them to tune in. There's a lot of choice out there, and it's quite complicated. So we looked at different ways in which vendors are tackling each one of these problems. And in the report we do cover, and I think we'll discuss some of this later in the discussion as well, different ways in which people are doing this, all the way from from things like personalization engines to, looking at more interactivity in screens. So there's lots of different approaches to this as well. Essentially, this is kind of my key takeaway from IBC, and that's that it's all about the bottom line. Essentially everything, and I think this is something a lot of people have said, that it's really, we're currently, the industry is still in a very much struggling economically, but as others have said, there was an upbeat mood at IBC this year. And I think one of the jokes was, is it that we've all developed a form of gallows humor? Or is it that there is actually some kind of light that's showing us maybe a way forward? And I think there probably is, in that things like AI, increased collaboration, moving things to the cloud, or showing ways that we can work that are more efficient, that actually make it sustainable for us to continue delivering content. So some of the key points that came out, at least from what I saw, is that the real demand is for technology that saves money, reduces the cost of doing things, whether that's moving to cloud to reduce hardware, whether it's using creators as a lower, as a form of content that's less cost that and brings in audiences, reducing effort. Again, movement towards AI as being something that's practical, something that actually does get rid of those repetitive tasks, that allows us to work faster, which then goes into speeding up delivery. Audiences really want things, as soon as possible, particularly in like a news environment. If it's breaking, they want it on their mobile phones and on their tablets and their set tops immediately. So, there is this expectation from audiences that we deliver things right away. A fourth one is around improving earnings. I mean, this is something we're all struggling with, particularly with changes in commercialization, with linear TV, commercials gone. How are we then moving this to the digital market, and how are we making money? So that's another big point. And then the final one is people really want technology that can also prove its worth, and this comes into data. There is a real move that, okay, so I'm going to invest in this product, but I really want to be able to see the numbers. It's like, show me that this is actually having a positive effect in the business. And I think this is something DPP has been looking at over the last year or so, kind of talking to CTOs and CFOs in the same session and seeing how they work together in that way and how they kind of justify spends in new technology. And that definitely is something that we saw a lot of at IBC as well. So that's kind of the presentation in a nutshell. So I thought I'd do that fairly quickly, but it just kind of gives a breakdown of what we looked at. And I'm sure we're going to be discussing a lot of the points then on this call too.
Brilliant, David. Thank you so much. So what we will do now is move on to the panel section of our webinar. And as David highlighted there, I think technology and emerging technology trends is obviously key. I think is a fundamental takeaway from IBC 2024. I guess it'd be a good place to start from there. So perhaps, Ian, if I could put a question to you to get us underway. From your perspective, how is technology leveling the playing field, for new market entrants? What sort of opportunities is it creating in 2024 and beyond?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that there's a sort of democratization, really, if you like, around sort of creating media, and also access to sort of tools and services that we've never seen before. So certainly the cloud is going a long way to sort of enable that, but there's also the cloud works differently to how we've sort of traditionally done stuff. And I think when we first started to sort of look at it, it was quite natural to sort of lift our existing technologies, put them on virtual machines in the cloud, and just expect us to work exactly the same way as we always have. But the reality is that I think the fundamental way in which technology works in the cloud means that actually you can start to buy things like microservices, or just things that you want when you want them, where you want them, how you need them, which then means that the cost and the barrier to entry of creating content, especially live content, has literally sort of not fallen through the floor, but sort of changed the market. That means there's a whole bunch of small companies now who can produce content, and there's a demand for that content both online, particularly around sports, with sports governing bodies wanting more and more content and stuff like that. It's not necessarily the broadcast media that's driving the change. It tends to be some of these kind of smaller companies.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's then about the sum of those smaller companies in all their parts and what impact that has on the sector. Because when we talk about market share, big players have then got to really consider the impact of that and how they can sort of stay ahead of the curve. I think, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of, I suppose, the wider impact on the market with the emergence and the opportunities that are then presented to smaller companies?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the sports theme, and we now see sort of all of the big sports have their own host broadcasting services.
Yeah.
So effectively, as broadcasters, we're just taking those world feeds and we're putting some content around it, and then we're pushing them out. That means that the sort of market has changed, but alongside that, everyone else wants access to live video and streaming of content and things like that, and that really means that there's a growth in the kind of small scale streaming companies who are actually making really innovative content, and making it for, as I say, different channels. And then alongside that, and the impact that has really on the technology chain is that people are now moving to more, rather than looking at workflows as we used to do in the hardware days, they're moving to sort of supply chain models. One indication of that is really the way the cloud stores media. For instance, we're used to storing files, and therefore in the old days we needed sort of big MAM systems to manage those files and things like that. The cloud tends to chunk up media, store things as objects, so we're seeing less sort of MAM system vendors and more sort of object share type workflows, which is really underlying sort of an underlying technical change, which is then changing the way that we work. So rather than thinking about our own workflows, we're thinking more about what our supply chain looks like, how we manage those supply chains, and what the interoperability looks like. So the focus of internal development now is very much on integration of these external tools. So people are buying tools and services far more than building them themselves for a bespoke sort of one-off workflow. They're more considering actually how does content coming from a myriad of different places come in, be curated, and then go out to a myriad of different places.
Thank you for that, Ian. That's really interesting. Danielle, what's your take? I mean, I know that obviously you work extensively with organizations right the way across the sector and sort of across the supply chain. How do you think technology is kind of, I suppose, transforming production processes? What are the benefits that companies are seeing from these emerging technologies at the moment?
Well, I absolutely agree with Ian that the cloud has been transformational for how media companies are working, but I do think that there's a big difference between vendors that are selling services that are cloud native versus cloud ready. So there's been a big move with a lot of vendors to adopt cloud transformation, but it's not necessarily compatible with tools that weren't built for it in the first instance. I think that AI is absolutely streamlining production processes, and I know that there is a lot of apprehension around this from many sectors, and media and broadcast is no exception. But I think in terms of, if we think of it from an automation perspective, it's really helping with the heavy lifting on some of those more mundane tasks. And having come from a creative background originally myself, there's a lot of parts of the job that aren't actually all that creative. So you can spend a lot of time doing quite menial tasks, and it's pulling you away from what you really want to be doing. So I think that AI can help with repetitive things like reviewing rushes, routine editing tasks, highlight creation, that sort of thing, and really free up skilled staff to spend time on the things that that are worthy of their attention. And it's really the difference between working till the early hours of the morning and then actually having a life.
I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, I mentioned it earlier. I just came from a conference in Boston, and that was on the HubSpot side of things. But obviously, the AI drives the conversation. But what's interesting is that we're now moving more and more down, as I mentioned, that kind of implementation of AI and how we actually use AI to improve in our efficiency. So it's not just about kind of content creation and generative AI. Let's go a bit deeper in AI. So, David, you referenced AI and the technology side of things. It is evolving now from being, I guess, that kind of buzzword that we know a bit about to something that is, I guess, changing the whole face of how we work and how we're going to work in the future. How is AI kind of helping to empower creators? What are promising kind of applications perhaps that you can sort of discuss or give some insight into from a content production side of things? And yeah, what's your take on it all?
So I agree very much with what Danielle said. I mean, it very much is. I know last year at IBC, there was a lot of buzz around generative AI, and there was a lot of fear as well. I mean, you had the strikes going on. You had a lot of companies worried about legal and ethical impacts. And I think vendors also were not quite sure how to position it. There was this idea about generative AI creating images, creating videos, and that isn't really what we're seeing now on the stands. We're seeing a practical use of AI, whether it's looking at content to identify people, actions in it. So it's been very useful. For example, I was speaking to someone who works in reality TV, and they have hundreds of hours of rushes every single day, and they have to put together a program at the end of that day. And that used to take a lot of people to go through because of the time factors involved, and it was an exhausting effort. Now they use generative AI, well, not generative, they use AI, multimodal AI to analyze it, and they're able to really determine, what it is they should give their attention to. So it allows the editors to draw that in. So that's one really good use. Another good use is around synopsizing. So when creating content specifically for different, platforms, whether it's social media, you want to get this down. AI has actually proven itself to be quite good at clipping, identifying video that might be of interest, even text that might be of interest. So this is not really removing the creative process. It's kind of directing the attention to the areas that are important. And I think as Danielle said before as well, these are tasks that most creatives saw as being repetitive, as being exhausting, keeping them up until the early hours until they could actually do the creative job they were trying to do. So to me, AI has kind of gone from, I think vendors now also are aware of how to position it. People are afraid of what AI potentially could do, but they're very excited by what it can do and by what it is doing today. So I think that's kind of the focus, and human in the loop is very much a part of that. It's something that helps humans, doesn't replace humans in that way. So.
And I think we're seeing that more and more, as you say, David. It's that kind of it's that balanced usage there. It's where you've got the human element, and even if that, there's this saying, isn't it? If you come down a mountain 2 degrees in the wrong direction, you end up in completely the wrong place. But if you start with the human piece, the creative bit, that process, and then you use AI to help you along the way, I think that's what we're seeing more and more now. So some interesting applications there. Ian, what's your view on it, and how that can perhaps benefit sort of you?
I mean, there's a lot of companies who are sort of taking the first steps into the analytical uses of AI. I think generative AI we're really cautious about. And for me, there's two things that we perhaps need to be cautious about. One of which is that actually a lot of the things we're using AI to do are what would traditionally have been entry-level jobs into the industry, and that scares me a little bit because logging of rushes and all of that kind of stuff is where a lot of us started, and maybe in 5-10 years time we're going to have a shortage of people coming into the industry with the skills that we need because they haven't been through that process. Maybe I'm just being a Luddite in that space, but I'll just run that flag up the pole. The other one in the generative space is obviously content attribution, particularly in the newsroom. So there was a lot of themes, a lot of discussions looking at how can we tell if content is real anymore. And I think that's a big theme, especially for the news broadcasters around that. So I'm not saying AI is good or bad. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of end users who are approaching it with caution. The good ones are sort of putting in management structures to think about, manage it, and rather than sort of jumping in with both feet. And you know, with any technology, there's good and bad, but it comes back to that democratization. I think the fact that now everyone can sort of create a relatively easy sort of CGI type video, that's great if what you want to do is storyboarding or sort of pre-visualization type workflows. It's also great if you want to create content that is perhaps going to influence, you know, world events or things like that. And so as newsrooms, we need to be a lot more cautious about where our content's coming from. Comes back to that authentication, the supply chain, and all of those things that we need to manage. I'm feeling that sort of, yeah, okay, this is interesting. It's not going to solve all of our problems. And there are some things that we perhaps just need to be a little bit aware of before we sort of jump in with both feet.
The authenticity is a huge point. I mean, it's one of the major things. I looked at it at NAB earlier this year because it was, you know, looking at CGPA, how companies are implementing that, as well as different tools that can detect, you know, not only show the provenance of content, but also then detect whether something has been modified or, you know, or generated by artificial means. But it is a huge issue for trust, and it's something that a lot of our members are very concerned about in that way. I was going to say on the other topic you mentioned around having non-creators creating content. It has been quite useful because a lot of times, like marketing, for example, you know, people working in marketing will produce the you know, clips that go to TikTok or that go to Instagram. But some of the tools I looked at as well provide kind of guardrails. So I know there were some examples where people were producing content that was not within brand or not within spec. And some of the products are putting in ways in which you can kind of define templates and say, you know, so that to ensure that people who are non-creatives, who are producing creative content, are at least sticking within the design they should be sticking within, which I thought was quite interesting.
I absolutely right. But I do think what's interesting, we talk again about, you know, the whole democratization, is that it comes a little bit back to what Ian was saying at the start. The capabilities now with AI, it does in a way level the playing field in some areas when it's used effectively, you know, whether it's from an efficiency perspective or a financial perspective, but it also keeps brands on their toes. You know, if other competitors or other organizations are starting to utilize these tools and utilize AI more effectively, you know, it does kind of drive that performance, because you've got to make sure that, you know, you're adopting it within your organization, that you're adopting it effectively. Danielle, if we just stay on the content thread then for a moment, what are your views on all of this, or perhaps, you know, challenges that are facing brands in terms of their own content production and engaging with their audience? What's your take on it all?
Well, just to touch on the point about kind of brand guardianship, I guess, and I think that has always been a problem. You know, I used to work on developing style guides for tier 1 media properties, and there was always somebody ready to go rogue and go off brand and do something they weren't supposed to. So I think that that's not a new problem that's associated with kind of ease of creation. If anything, the outcome that's created is probably better than what it could have been without those tools. But I think that versioning is an interesting area, because that is a huge part of the creative process, and kind of getting past that point where somebody's saying to you, oh, it's not what I envisaged in my head. And really, they can't articulate exactly what they want, but it's a version of what you've created. So rather than kind of going back to the storyboard and starting all over again, you can now rapidly iterate and create lots of different versions and kind of help reduce that process where it's kind of creativity by committee, I suppose. So I think that it'd be incredibly useful for that process.
Do you think sorry, go on, David.
No, the versioning is very important too, because now, as you said, with all the different versions that have to be produced, I mean, companies are producing hundreds sometimes of versions for different platforms, different audiences. So yeah, I mean, you cannot have creatives producing all those hundreds of pieces of content. So how do you produce them? So it is a challenge.
I think you're absolutely right. And I put it to the panel really, if anybody wants to kind of jump in. What's your view on how that perhaps supports with creating a community or reaching different audiences? You know, I mean, David touched upon it there, but let's talk a little bit more about that and how that perhaps diversification and breadth enables us to reach audiences at scale.
The democratization is very important. Ian touched on it as well earlier with sports. I mean, with the fact that you can now have lower cost live production, you're
Yeah.
seeing, like you're seeking like, lower football leagues. It's not just Premier League who are now being able to produce content because it's now accessible to clubs in different divisions to produce high quality content. A lot of the channels are utilizing creators because they're coming up with stuff which is really quite novel. And on top of that, they also have their own sort of audiences already existing. So these are people that have a bit of a fan base. So, for channels to utilize their content brings them on. So I think democratization is really not only, it's just opening us up to a lot more content, which we wouldn't have been able to afford to produce in the past because of the audience for that. So I think it's quite exciting. It's really opening up to a lot more niche, a lot more unique content. So I think it's enriching that.
I also think it's how the audience behaviors are changing. I think right early on during the show, I think Ofcom announced that news had flipped almost to the majority of people getting their news from online sources rather than broadcast media. Yeah. And we shouldn't underestimate the impact of that, because we all know the problems with creating sort of echo chambers and very personalized and selective things, and that means that people can access not only their news content, their sports content, their entertainment content from a myriad of different places, and that's challenging. That's challenging for everyone who's ever been in a space where you're the creator and the owner of that content. And how do we keep relevant in that space? How do we keep reaching our audiences who are in that space? And it's not just as simple anymore as just being on those platforms. You have to create content that is specific for those platforms. You can't just sort of take the video that you put on your television and put it on all the different platforms. TikTok's got a different feel to Instagram's got a different feel to LinkedIn, to Facebook. They're all very different places, and therefore your brand identity may be different, depending where you're landing. And then you've got to manage all that content, and I think that's one of the things that we were trying to do. And I think we saw quite a lot of interest in on a project we were showing on the AWS stand called Cloud Native Agile Production, or Time Addressable Media Store, where you can sort of bring streams of content in one way and then use that to manage multiple versions of that content through multiple parts of the workflow. So we need to start thinking about solutions that enable us to bring content in, because all the time we're dealing in files, we're duplicating them, we're increasing our storage, we're increasing our costs, we're increasing our complexity in managing those workflows. So there's a whole bunch of impacts that are perhaps a little bit hidden under the initial oh, this is great, we can create loads of content. We've also got to manage, distribute, attribute, and sort of think about what that means, and not create just big lakes of digital slush.
I think that's fascinating. I think as well, it's kind of I think it's the changing face of customer expectations. You've all spoken quite heavily there. We've used sports as an example. I think it's a great example because now we've got that breadth of content, and it starts to become more about not can I watch this game on TV? It's where can I watch this game? Or it's an expectation. I can access a certain piece of content or a certain thing, and it's the expectation. So what do brands need to do to, I guess, deliver on that, to deliver on customer expectation, but also retain quality? Because some of these things that we're talking about are going to impact quality. David, what's your take on that side of things?
I think it's something people are struggling with. I think the first one is getting a better understanding of what audiences on each platform want. As Ian was saying, it is very different. What people who watch TikTok and others who are on Instagram or maybe on other platforms have very different demographics, very different expectations. So I think it's something that we have to do, channels have to do in order to better engage those audiences. As I alluded to before, because of the sheer amount of versions that have to be created, it's very difficult to have that done by creatives and to enable them to spend the time. So I think, I think AI is one of the better ways of enabling these versions to be created in a slightly more, in a way which still ensures the quality is there. But I think there do need to be rules around, as Danielle said earlier too, about, there does need to be some kind of safeguards put in, and I think that's something that we're still working on and developing. But I think a lot of channels are just finding it difficult. It's almost impossible to do it without some kind of use of AI or automation in producing these.
Yeah. This level of interconnectivity as well and everything surrounding it, I mean, it brings with it a lot of challenges, right? I mean, things like metadata have been talked about for a long time, keeping all of your, keeping consistency then, let's say. Ian, Danielle, do you have any thoughts on that? And perhaps, where we are with it now, but also what we need to be thinking about in sort of the next year and beyond?
I do. I mean, I've been talking about metadata for 20 years, really, since we first went file-based and sort of the metadata that we would enter into the cameras and the brilliance of metadata and how it's going to solve all of our problems. And the reality is I don't think it has. I think it's just helped us recognize that, we could do better if we tagged our content better, but nobody's come up with a magic bullet yet that enables us to do that. Now, AI may be the magic bullet that does that, but I suspect it's going to suffer the same problems as humans, which is it will describe the same content in different ways, depending on the AI engine that you use to analyze it. So, we all know that metadata is going to be key. We all know that there are challenges, particularly with temporal metadata, so metadata that changes over time. So an example of that could be a scoreline in a sports event. It's all very well saying this is a team A versus team B. That's static, that doesn't change. It's quite easy to label metadata with that, but at certain things, time-based events happen. There's a little bit of work in the IMF and the DPP work that's going on around delivery around that. We're certainly looking at how you manage those sort of time-based events. They then lead to automated highlights and things like that you can serve out to audiences. But the problem's not been solved, and I'm not entirely sure it ever will be, if I can be controversial. Because we haven't solved it yet in 20 years. I'm not entirely sure that we're going to solve it in the next 5. So yeah, I don't have the answer, and I'd be lovely to have somebody who thinks they have, but I'm pretty sure nobody has.
Sorry, go on, Danielle.
No, I want to chip in on that because I fully agree with Ian there. I think, and I think metadata is almost unsolvable, and I think too many people are trying to use it in too many different ways, and there's a lack of agreement. From what I'm seeing, and this might be controversial as well, I kind of think metadata is going to, I'm thinking it's going to go away, and we're going to end up with a more semantic approach to data.
Yeah.
And I think that not only enables us to interact with data, because metadata is very limiting in terms of what we can ask of it, and having a more semantic approach, it also enables us to take other forms of information, whether it's video, whether it's audio recordings, whether it's PDF files, and kind of bring that in and kind of this knowledge-based approach. And I don't know how we're going to get there because it'd be difficult to get to that point. There are some companies that are trying to move into that space, but I kind of think that might be the way forward, to get away from metadata and limitations.
I'd take us back to actually our most basic form of metadata, which we've had since the very beginning, which is really time and time code. And we're still talking about time addressable media. If we know where content was created, that's location, but when it was created, we can quite often tie events to that. So I think events against time is probably the place where is going to be our most basic level. And if we tie everything back to that as almost as our lowest common denominator, then that then gives us the freedom to do whatever else we need over the top of that, depending on our individual sort of needs and requirements.
Danielle, is this something that you see as a challenge for the brands that you work with within the sector?
Yeah, I agree with both of you that the standardization of metadata has been a project for a couple of decades, and it's not really It's not really reached a consensus, especially when you're acquiring content from lots of different sources. I mean, aside from the individual kind of human perception of whether you refer to something as a rifle or a gun to identify content that might be an issue from a compliance perspective, for example, I think that we're going to move beyond that to more of a contextual search that's AI enabled. And I've seen a couple of companies that have had great success with this in terms of having more of a conversation and a dialogue with kind of an AI librarian, as it were, to kind of look at content from a perspective that's, if you want to search for a red sports car, it understands that you're looking for a car that's on a street and not a toy car that's sitting on a table. And that level of it goes beyond the object and into the scene that it's sitting within. So I think that we're going to move beyond those restrictive tags and more towards descriptive data that's much more open and gives us a lot more potential.
Did you think? Sorry, go on, Ian. Go on.
No, I was going to throw in another challenge there, because I think what we're seeing with a lot of the AI engines is its ability to identify objects, and that's relatively easy because objects don't have rights. As we sort of want to identify people, that becomes a lot more problematic, and you know, it's quite easy to sort of train the metadata model or the AI engines on to sort of produce the metadata that manages to tag objects, because there's a whole wealth of images out there that are mined by the internet. To sort of do the same thing with video content and people, particularly those that are owned by the big broadcasters, means that we've got to expose our content to these engines to learn this content. And I don't think there's a single broadcaster out there who would not approach that with extreme caution because of the rights and all of the associated potential revenue streams that are tied up in that. So we're going to, I think we're probably going to see some challenging times ahead with these training models, and for the first time, I think this year we're hearing more about sort of small language models rather than large language models. So individual companies who are sort of looking at how they can train on their own archives, how they can train on their own content without exposing it to the sort of large metadata players. So that's going to be an interesting point that we probably need to tackle at some point.
I think it's also worth bearing in mind that there is the audio element as well. That it's not a purely visual search. That if you're wanting to find athletes within a football game, for example, then
speech to text, you
can use the audio element as well.
I think that's a really powerful this kind of speech to text, speech to search stuff. You know, we were doing that with OCR and subtitles sort of many years ago now, and I just sat next to somebody and said, well, we've got all of our sort of content that's been subtitled, haven't we? Got all of the audio parts of that through the subtitle files, and it appears that actually it's easier to run speech to text and analytics and an AI engine over it than it is to sort of go through all the subtitle files. But
I was going to say, Ian, there is an interesting product I saw at NAB this year, and it was around at IBC again this year, called Human and Digital. I'm not sure if you've seen that. But it does work with that kind of that really difficult area of identifying, human, actors, and also even things like personas and characters and things, and to identify those in media. So it's an interesting project in terms of, trying to navigate some of those landmines of dealing with, identifying people. In content.
There'll be ways of doing it.
That's actually a client of ours.
Oh yeah.
There you go.
They haven't written me a check yet, so I can't.
No.
Well, David, Ian, Danielle, I'd love to dive even deeper into some of the areas that we've talked about. You could probably do a kind of a 1-hour webinar on every strand and every thread, but unfortunately we're out of time on that section. So thank you all for your insight to this point. But what we will now do is move on to the Q&A. So we've had a couple that have come through privately. I'm going to actually lead with one though that's come on in the chat, because somebody's kind of shot from the hip with a question here and gone straight in. So we'll tackle that one. Folks, please don't hesitate to send your questions through. I'm going to put these to the panel. And yeah, what we'll do, folks, is we'll fire through these so we can get through a few if that's okay. But I'd love to know your take. So Oscar Moonulty has said, how are tier one broadcasters going to adapt and recoup the lost advertising revenue that they've hemorrhaged to digital and streaming platforms in recent years? I'm going to put that one out there to the panel to really get us underway. Who would like to go first on that?
I'm going to back away from that one, soon as we're not advertising funded. And
there you go, Ian. I don't blame you on that one, David.
My own feeling is I'm not sure we'll ever reach the point in which broadcasters are making the same revenues they were making back in the TV world. But I think that in order to do this, people need to have a better, and this is one of the areas I was getting at with understanding audiences. Advertisers in particular want to have a lot more information about the audience. They want to have a lot more information about the context of the media that's playing out. And I think the more information that channels that broadcasters can provide to advertisers means that they're going to be able to increase their monetization of that content. And I think there's also other ways. Like I think, I saw some technology at IBC around being a bit more customizable in terms of ad breaks. I think, some of the traditional ways in which ad breaks are presented is disruptive, whereas there's ways to kind of adapt that more to how users watch. Advertisers are very picky about how their brands are presented in ad breaks. If it's a bad experience, it leads to bad brand reputation. So I think, Claire put in here monetizing those platforms. That's correct, but I think it needs to be more intelligent monetization, and this also gets back into one of the points I talked about earlier in terms of advertisers want to have that demonstrable ROI. If they're putting in that they have lots of places now to spend their money, huge numbers of options, they want to know exactly will this return on what they spend. So I think some of that revenue will be recouped, but I think it needs to be done in a more intelligent way.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that there needs to be more of a focus on dynamic ad insertion, because if you look at how the model of advertising has shifted over the last few years, if you take kind of basic demographics, I'm a woman over 40 and I live in the UK, that doesn't necessarily mean I have very much in common with other people in that group. So I think that it's interesting that there's more of a focus on psychographics, behaviors, interests, lifestyle. These are the things that can kind of cross traditional demographics and connect and resonate with audiences so that those adverts feel less intrusive. And I think, we've been experiencing this for some time on platforms like YouTube, where a few years ago, having never watched a makeup tutorial in my life, I would be served up a lot of beauty brand adverts. And now I start to see that it's much more related to my interests and the things that I'm focused on.
Yeah, no, I think that makes absolute sense. There was an ad not long ago about the now King Charles, who was, I think, Prince Charles at the time, and Ozzy Osbourne, and the fact that there were 5 or 6 key things that they shared in common, and yet you definitely would not serve them both with the same ads for the same content. And now that broadcasters have got all that data, you can refine that whole process. And much like we have on digital platforms, a lot of digital platforms and social media platforms, you can better start to target your advertising. Sorry,
I will come back and just say, actually, there are a couple of things that we are looking at that are key to both advertising and some of the work we do. So personalization, and I think the panel have touched on that is really key. And from our perspective, there's that element of, if you can personalize content, people engage with it. Now that's attractive to us in audience retention, but it's also very attractive to advertisers. I think secondly, generative AI, it's not a huge leap to then go into product placement and sort of create content that is different for different audiences, with different products perhaps aimed at different markets or even different people, and also I think we're kind of knowing what you've already seen. So I'm pretty bored at the moment of sort of seeing the same adverts over and over again, and where's guilty of that. I go on to BBC Sounds and I listen to a podcast, and I'll hear the same trailer for the same podcast 15, 20, and if I haven't listened to it by then, I'm probably never going to listen to it. So knowing what the behaviors are, their previous behaviors, enables us to target those audiences in slightly different ways. So recommendations, not avoiding repetition and product placement, I think, are probably the three things that I'd put into those areas that people seriously need to look at, both as audience engagement and potentially advertising revenue.
I guess brands like AdSmart and things can then start to drive the way in that. They can decide, you know, they can innovate in terms of how best to do audience targeting and you know, empower providers then with the right kind of solutions for that. We've had another, sorry, go on.
No,
Very quickly.
just quickly, finding ways to advertise without a disruptive ad break is very important. And Ian made a point about, I mean, I saw there was one demo I saw at NAB this year where, you know, they had a shopping bag in the scene, and you know, in the UK it was Tesco's, and in the US it was Safeway. I mean, you know, different things that, or even putting different ads on a billboard in the content, non-disruptive, but it still brings a message. Anyway, sorry about that.
That's really valuable. No, you're spot on. That makes absolute sense. A question here from Dipali. How are advancements in AI and ML, so machine learning, shaping the overall content creation process? So we sort of touched on that, I think, but what's your view in how, I guess it's difficult, isn't it? But in a nutshell, how is that shaping the future, perhaps, of content creation and the content creation process specifically? To the panel, to anything.
There's two different elements you could in the live space, you know, things like automated highlights, things like sort of event identification, and those sorts of things can lead to those more personalized audience engagement stuff. So I can, you know, if I can just go on and say, show me every time such and such a player, you know, scored such and such a try or whatever, I can sort of drive that down there. In the sort of pre-recorded drama space, I think that's probably where we'll see, you know, I think as David mentioned very early in his report, the sort of driving of costs down. You know, 2-3 years ago we were all talking about virtual sets and sort of the no need to shoot drama out on location anymore. We're just going to shoot it in big sound stages at, you know, with volumetric capture and virtual sets. Don't know whatever happened to that idea, but the idea that actually you can use AI to generate those sets more cost effectively than has ever been done before, I think is great. But, you know, let's not forget there are massive art departments that do that work already. So hopefully it's an ability to try, iterate and fail more quickly rather than a sort of move to completely replace that, although there'll probably be a little bit of both, obviously.
I think with that one, the AI and ML was using AI to generate sort of virtual reality sets, I think was very good. But I think with 5G technology, with the lower cost of cameras, it's now no longer, and cloud-like production, it's no longer that expensive to go out on site to actually film something. And as you said, it may be more expensive to actually design a VR AR set than it is just to go somewhere and film it on a mobile phone.
Gone full circle in 2 years,
Yeah. One interesting point as well is say about AI. I saw another app at IBC where people could film something on their mobile phones, and it actually made it look like it was film. And that was all using AI to kind of, you know, use effects in that to do that, which actually looked, it wasn't great, but you know, it kind of looked okay.
But is that just a feel? I mean, I do wonder how much AI is sometimes just rebranding of existing technologies as well. Because that to me just sounds like an Instagram filter you've described there, and
pretty much.
You know, but actually if we call it AI, then hey, that makes it, you know,
you've got to have AI now. If you're an emerging technology or a brand, you've got to put AI either in the domain name or the business name, and then
or cloud
folks, final question, and this one came through and it's perfect actually, so I'm going to pose it to each one of you if that's okay, as a bit of a, and I'm going to give you strictly 30 seconds each to get a feel for what the future holds. So somebody's come through and said, what would you like to see at IBC 2025? So let's put that to you one by one. What are your expectations, or what would you like to see kind of this time next year? What are we going to be talking about at IBC 2025? Who wants to go first?
I can go.
Go for it, Danielle.
So I would really like to see a bridge built between social platforms and broadcasters and community engagement. I think that we've started to explore this area, but it's very much kind of serving up versions of to social platforms. And I think that there's a massive opportunity to build more of a two-way conversation, to increase interactivity, gamification, and kind of deepen that connection with audiences. And I think that that burgeoning creator economy could also benefit from that broadcast experience, and that creating a bit more of a symbiotic relationship there, particularly around live events.
I was kind there. I gave you an extra 20 seconds.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Ian.
I'm going to say that the short one's more diversity. I'd like to see a lot more diversity, you know, and have more of those conversations around diversity. And I mean that in its broadest sense, not only gender but ethnic, and it is still very white and male. But in short, if I put my tech geek on, I'd say containerized applications. So little applications, microservices that I can deploy quickly, easily, pay for. You know, move away from capex and opex and just sort of pay per use type applications that I can deploy quickly, both on the edge, in the cloud, and on-prem. Therefore, leading to kind of a lot more sustainable stuff. So I've got sustainability, diversity, and cloud all in my wish list there. So
perfect, makes absolute sense. I back all of that. And finally, David.
Ian actually took my answer, which is why I made a face. I was going to say diversity as well, but I'm gonna give it a slightly different spin. So at NAB this year, I think it's 54% of attendees were first-time attendees, and there was a real buzz. There was a different energy at NAB that I had never seen there before, and that was also missing from IBC this year. And I think having the diversity, having younger attendees, having people from you know, different genders and ethnic backgrounds, and I think it leads to more. I think it just leads us to really develop new things and talk about stuff in different ways. And I think IBC this year was great, but it felt like a harkening back to IBCs of the past, almost in a way. And I kind of think it missed some of that excitement that, you know, that could have happened if there was a younger, more diverse audience. So yeah.
There you go. So diversity, top of the list. So let's hope we see some change. Let's be a part of that change in the coming months and in the build-up as well. So
see the three white blokes.
Yes, yeah. I haven't even got to come back for that. I agree.
No, he's absolutely right.
Folks, David, Danielle, Ian, thank you so much for your time. It's been super valuable. Thank you to all those who have joined us. As I mentioned earlier, we will make sure that you get a copy of the recording. You'll also get a full copy of the deck. Thank you also to Chris Parry and the Media Collective, who has supported in the amplification and the communication of this event. But yeah, just finally, one more time, if you'd like to join me with any positive sentiment in the chat and a little virtual round of applause, thank you again to Ian, to Danielle and David. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you next time. Cheers. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.